the survey outlined is that about 8 out of 10 companies have actually experienced some sort of economic crime or fraud and incurred losses as a consequence of that. But then if you look at some of the companies that suffered bigger losses, quite a number of them, 4% of them, in essence, incurred losses of more than 1.5 billion rand in terms of those fraud losses. So I think it is staggering to look at the extent to which economic crime has started to impact businesses, and we are specifically concerned about SMEs and their ability to actually combat this scourge, I think, in society.
Yeah, it's even more staggering when we look at those numbers and we juxtapose it with the fact that not many businesses actually have strategies in place to prevent fraud.
I think, Michelle, that's the scary bit, to the extent that you have small businesses that are often constrained with their resources. It is becoming a much greater threat, and our appeal to them is to have a much greater level of awareness and to see what can be done to try and prevent the extent of the fraud that they might be suffering.
Ben, are you saying that some businesses actually can't afford to put these strategies in place?
Well, I think one needs to look at the current economic environment, and you need to understand that SMEs often have difficulty in implementing sophisticated systems, processes, or creating internal audit teams. So a small business is typically constrained with its resources. But we do believe that there are a few hints and tips that they can follow to try and minimize this threat. So to the extent that a small business, just imagine a grocery store on the corner or a filling station, I think you always have a bit of a constraint in terms of your own resources to try and implement formalized policies for checks and balances to try and mitigate the risk of fraud. So I think that's what we suggest.
So take us through, what these losses to fraud look like. You're talking particularly around the issue of SMEs. When we talk about the 740 million rand that's been lost to fraud, what form does that take?
Michelle, I think one needs to differentiate between two types of threats. There's an internal threat in every business, and that's your employees. And it saddens me to say so, but I think a lot of this fraud is essentially constructed, done, executed by employees. And then there's also an external threat. So if you look at your employees who are controlling a lot of the critical processes in your business, whether it's procurement, paying for expenses, or essentially collecting the revenue that the business earns, those are the vulnerable areas where business needs to be very, very careful, because your employees who you trust and who you rely on, they could essentially, due to a number of reasons, be the agents and the people that are committing this fraud. But then again, I think that the majority of the trends that we see is a massive increase in cybercrime. So it's again an external threat where people that you don't know, clients that you don't know, or people that are not your clients rather, they are actually the instigators and the agents of the fraud and the crime that gets committed. So what a business needs to do is to look very carefully at, I always tell them, follow the money, and make sure that you look at all the expenses that you're incurring, all the revenues that you are collecting, because each one of those events have a potential to essentially be subjected to fraud.
I mean, when we're saying these companies are losing money to fraud, essentially money is being stolen from them. The books are being doctored. When you talk about the internal and the external threat, internally, if it is my own accountant, it's essentially my books are being doctored and money is being stolen from me.
Yeah, it's actually quite simple. Sometimes you can just overinflate an invoice. Yeah. So a business incurs an expense. You are in collusion with the supplier. You increase the amount of money that's due, and the supplier and the employee shares the additional cost that was incurred that was unjustified. And the same thing when you issue an invoice or you make a sale and there's revenue that's due to the company. If that's inflated and it doesn't all go back to the company, it's almost like skimming off the top or skimming off the bottom. And that's where essentially some of the revenues that are due to the organization gets missed, gets lost. And also when expenses are inflated, then the company suffers a higher level of expense. And it's a very innovative and creative ways that individuals come up with to try and defraud the organization.
Yeah. So you were talking to us about tips that SMEs in particular can implement to try and minimize fraud. One would think that when it comes to, you talked about the issue of an internal and an external threat. It's perhaps harder, Ben, and you'll correct me here if I'm wrong, but harder to regulate the internal threat of fraud because so much of the relationship, say, with employees is based on trust?
Well, there are things that you can do because I think we do have a very strong trust relationship with our employees, but there are good practices that need to be followed. I think if one reviews on a regular basis all the critical points in your business where invoices are generated or money is collected, and there's an oversight and an awareness that it gets checked, I think that prevents people from being tempted into committing fraud. I think it's important, and that's one of our recommendations to SMEs as well, is to look at a formal process every year where certain vulnerable parts of your business are audited. That incurs an expense. We recognize that. But we think that if you have structures and processes in place that makes your employees aware that there are checks and balances, it will decrease the incidence and the potential of fraud dramatically. But I think it all starts with what you mentioned in terms of our trust relationship with our employees. And they are important soldiers in this fight against crime, because if there's a clear policy in the company and there's a clear awareness in the company, it also aligns the employees to try and support the company in preventing the fraud, to be more aware. But I think, Michelle, it's also important to recognize that I think in general, after the pandemic, and the pandemic's not yet over, we recognize that there's a lot of financial stress in our employees, and we need to monitor that and see what can be done to try and alleviate, because that's sometimes the trigger where you have a trustworthy employee, but they are in such financial difficulty that the temptation of committing fraud becomes higher. And that's another way that I think SMEs can just stay close to their employees and understand the difficulties that people might be facing. It doesn't justify it, but it can also prevent that from happening on a regular basis.
Ben, let me ask you this. When we talk about the issue of having a financial manager, particularly for an SME, do you reckon that it's safer to have a single individual as a financial manager or multiple individuals? And again, I suppose this is prohibitive for SMEs. It's perhaps a step that can be taken only by big corporations.
It is always better to have a segregation of duties where you have two individuals that make a decision, execute a process, but it's not always possible, and in SMEs specifically, it is not always affordable. What I think you can then do is to change duties on a regular basis. So if you have a single financial manager that incurs or that carries a lot of responsibility, one needs to recognize the pressurized situation that individual is put in, and you need to then find a way to put the person on leave or to change job descriptions and get another individual, typically the entrepreneur himself or herself, that can sometimes take over the duties of the financial manager, because purely by having another person on an ad hoc basis performing the same duties, you are decreasing the possibility that fraud can be committed dramatically. But you're right, Michelle, it's not always possible to have two people doing the job, but there are ways and means that you can actually mitigate that risk if you do have a segregation of duties on a regular basis.
On the issue of working remotely, which has become a new way of working for many small businesses, for many big corporations as well in the wake of the pandemic, has this increased the threat of fraud for companies? Absolutely.
I think that the mere fact that you are now reliant, or to a much greater extent reliant on remote communications, means that what you could control within your premises is now suddenly moving 30, 40 kilometers away to your employee's home. It increases the risk on a number of fronts. It allows those cybercrime criminals sitting in basements in Eastern Europe access to your resources in your organization, but also because things have to be done much more in cyberspace, the cyberspace risk, I think, has dramatically increased. So it is about looking at the technologies that are being used, the processes that haven't been redefined for catering for the fact that you have people working remotely. And I think just the incidence of cybercrime that increased so dramatically during the period of the pandemic is already an indication that we are much more exposed to that kind of risk. Very worrying indeed.